So greetings, my name is Alex Desherbinen. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Conference on Managed Retreat, it is my delight to introduce Jola Ajibade, who is really one of the leading lights on the topic of managed retreat in the US and I think internationally, because a lot of her work touches on issues internationally. She'll be speaking on global mapping of models of success and equity in managed retreat. I want to make clear that we asked Jola, after she had prepared a normal panel presentation, we asked her if she would be willing to do it as a keynote. So this will not be maybe in the same vein as some of the other keynotes. She will have a scientific presentation, and then I think she'll have some remarks afterwards. If time allows, we are going to entertain Q&A and some chat questions. Probably best if you use the chat function. It's just a little more easy for Jola to get back to you by chat if she's not able to do it during the session itself. I did want to mention that Jola wrote a paper with some colleagues in 2020 in a Journal of Global Environmental Change, which is a very high impact journal, on why climate migration is not managed retreat, 6 justifications. And I commend it to all of you to read that article. It really lays out, as someone who personally really considers myself more of a climate mobility expert and focused on climate migration, it does help to disentangle some of the ambiguities that arise as people refer to managed retreat, sometimes interchangeably with climate migration. So I'm going to briefly give you Jola's bio. She's an assistant professor of geography at Portland State University. She applies an environmental justice and political ecology lens to study how individuals, communities, and cities respond to climate change and their different capacities for adaptation and transformation. Specifically, she examines the politics of adaptation, demonstrating how historical injustices, state practices, relocation programs, and utopian solutions to climate change intertwine with exclusionary planning policies and development patterns to undermine disadvantaged and marginalized communities. So again, Jola, we're very excited to hear what you have to say, and take it away, please.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm gonna try and share my slides. Let's see that. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Thank you everyone for being here. It's really a pleasure to share some of this work that I've been doing with you all. And thank you, Alex, again for that warm introduction. I'm just gonna start by telling you a little bit from my language. I speak Yoruba, I'm a Yoruba person. And in my language, we have this proverb about retreats. It says, Moja Mosala Maki Konjiloju Ogun, which means the brave and the wise soldier knows when to advance or retreat. And retreat is a sign of wisdom and courage, not defeat. But what this proverb does not tell us is about the war itself. People are confronting different wars or threats. For some, the biggest challenges are flooding and coastal erosion and sea level rise. And for others, the challenges are food insecurity and lack of livelihood exacerbated by structural inequality and political marginalization. For some, it is hazardous air quality, theft of land, and poisoning of their waters and land. And for many Black people in America, racism and racial profiling poses serious and imminent threats to life and health, even more so than flooding. Hence, the decision to retreat or not depends on the sets of risks or problems that people deem as threatening to their existence. That is, to their existence today, not just in 30, 50, or 100 years. Therefore, we cannot assume that we know the adaptation option that people need until we understand the compounding threats that they are fighting and their daily struggles for survival. As a young girl, I lived in a home that got repetitively flooded. So flooding was very much normalized in my house. We just had it every year. And then between fighting flood and malaria and typhoid, which is very common in Nigeria, and also I was worried. I wasn't even sure I would live up to 20 years. But even when my parents decided it was time to relocate to a new home, we had to think about my grandmother, we typically would just walk up and down the compound where we lived, just on the ground floor. But when we relocated and moved on to a higher ground, which meant we moved on to a house that had a staircase, she couldn't go around anymore. So even when people live in the same neighborhood, we must remember that we live in a pluriverse with different realities shaped by our age, our gender, our race, and our different abilities. And therefore, those things may also shape access to resources and also our exposure to intersecting risks and hazards. We need all adaptation options to be on the table, and communities must have a say in their own future. The theme of this conference, At What Point Manage Retreat, Resilience, Relocation, and Climate Justice, is particularly salient to what I hope to share with you today. I do not plan to prescribe a model for justice or success, but to share with you our observations from analyzing 150 empirical case studies from across the world. I hope that by drawing attention to these findings, I may partially answer the question, how can justice consideration be at the center of responses to climate displacement? And how can retreat be a part of the solution and not the problem? So I'm going to move on to the research. And before I do, though, I really want to thank all of the contributors to this work that I'm about to share with you today. My research group, Meghan Sullivan, Chris Loa, Allie Reilly, Lizzie Yarina, and Larisa Ovales. They've been really great in helping with this work. So thank you. So I'm starting with this work from Liberia. As you can see the picture there, over 75,000 people in West Point are exposed to sea level rise, erosion, and flooding. And the government believes that relocating the slum population to peri-urban area and to rural area is the solution. And they claim this has to do with climate change. However, the residents see that this geographic displacement is a greater risk because it's going to lead to potential loss of livelihoods, including social, cultural, and economic assets will be lost. Similar example in Lagos, I published a paper in 2019 documenting how several communities on the waterfront in Lagos have been displaced in the name of addressing climate change, and how is it that the wealthier and the elites are actually now building new structures in those places. In Senegal, what we've learned is that even though communities over there are also exposed to sea level rise and flooding, are in fact willing to relocate. Some of them have been relocated to highways and what they call barren lands, and many of them have said life is not good here. When you move to Mozambique, as many of you know, in the past 5 years, people in Mozambique have been experiencing severe flooding. And so there has been relocation in Mozambique as well. But what happened after relocation is that people said, we used to have our farms, but now we rely on food aid. So there are several negative impacts of retreat that people have documented across different literature, from indebtedness to loss of access to land, forestry, fisheries, and also to chronic poverty, disruption to social networks, and also loss of identity and culture. However, we also know that not all retreats are the same. Some retreats merely hide the actual problem and translocate it to another location, thereby worsening and indeed creating more harm for underrepresented people. But there are some retreats that we've found that actually has improved people's lives. And I hope to share some of those success stories with you. But before I do that, I also want to question even this idea of success model. What are the models of successful relocation? The question is, who defines success? Success for whom? Is it for the communities that are relocating? Is it the communities that are receiving these communities that are benefactors? Is it academics, you and I, who has been writing and doing this research, are we the ones that are supposed to be defining success? Or is it multiple stakeholders like the government and the NGOs? Who is defining success? And success for whom? What are some of the metrics that we need to use when defining success? And how do different models of success intersect with justice issues? What will happen to new resettlement areas in 30, 50, 100 years? I presented on a panel this morning. I showed what happened in the case of Rohingya refugees. So even when we move people, what happens to those new places? We need to think about them. Who benefits or loses from retreats? This is this question many of the presentations throughout this conference have been touching upon. And also, how does the process and outcome, how do those two things intersect with justice issues as well as with this idea of success and relocation? And what is the timeline that we're using when we're evaluating success? Is it post the relocation? Is it 5 years, 10 years into relocation? How do we define those things? These are really critical questions that are not easy to answer. And does decision-making model, determine success? I'm hoping that this presentation will help to answer some of this question in some way. So obviously we cannot go to all of the countries where this is happening. So what we did was to do an article search methodology, looking at articles published between 2000 to 2020. And because, just as Alex Deshebini just said earlier, I separated out what is climate migration and what is climate relocation. So we looked at Google Scholar because there was tons of articles you could get from there, and also the Web of Science. And we excluded reading closely papers that really were just about people moving on their own, just collective mobility or individual mobilities. We excluded climate migration in that sense, and from relocation. And also we excluded theoretical papers from empirical case studies because we were interested only in empirical case studies when people have moved and where discussion of success were mentioned. And we also focused largely on post-resettlements to understand what happens to people afterward. And many of the authors we looked at did document the process as well. And we separated the post-resettlement from current and ongoing relocation plans, and also the ones that also focused on success issues and talked about it in different ways. And one of the key things I want to say here is that the unsuccessful cases were several of them, were cases where people were forced, or where people returned to the land, or where people remained in detrimental limbo, where the government promised they would relocate them, but then they've been there for several years, 10, 15 years. So all of those types of cases were classified as unsuccessful. So when we move into the issue of success model, there were 5 key models we're seeing that is emerging across the world. One is the techno-managerial model, which quite frankly does not pay attention to equity. It's just about moving people from point A to B. And there were several cases like that. But we determined that it was successful because people did move and they didn't go back. And also, in some cases, some of those vulnerabilities, some of those cases did increase vulnerability when people moved but didn't go back. But we still documented because the government might determine that was successful in the ways in which it was done. So that was there. And many of those techno-managerial models, we did see this cost-benefit analysis as one of the determinants. Then we found another situation where many of the relocations were just focused on ecological restoration, which we believe were important. So exploration of land, ocean, preservation of non-human species, flora, fauna, ecosystem preservation. We saw a lot of these. We documented all the cases we found in that area, and how some of, in fact, some residential areas were also rezoned to be grassland parks and all of that, So we documented it. And there were cases that were compensatory, which is basically just giving people money for loss and damages. In the US here, it's called buyouts. So there were tons of buyouts that we documented, as well as in Europe and in the US, we documented those cases. Again, here in the buyout cases, we saw that most of them were motivated by cost-benefit analysis. And for some, it did not really address issue of justice, but we'll talk about that. And then the other case here is reformative, as you can see here. We saw cases here where community-led relocation programs, it also allows for retaining community ties, improve community well-being. I'll show you examples and you'll see why this is in fact reformative. And it's reformative in the sense that it doesn't structurally change the society, it doesn't change the community structurally, but it addresses some of the livelihood concerns that many people have raised throughout the conference. And then there was a final case, which was very few, just 2 cases that really stood out to us. This was a transformative justice case where the relocation was accompanied by structural change. Number one, it allowed for the maintenance of connection to land. The relocation fostered ecological, social, cultural, and economic well-being. It also included climate mitigation and energy renewal, or renewable energy, access to renewable energy sources, gender empowerment, capacity building. Children that were out of school now had access to new schools. So those cases were just exemplars in how it happened. And so I'll be showing you some of those cases. And one of the key things that was important for us, apart from looking at this model, we also know that retreat intersect with several justice issues. Number one, it intersects with issues of recognition justice, right? So we're trying to answer this question, how does this model also intersect with justice issues? So number one, thinking about recognition justice, we recognize that colonial and historical factors that displaces people are still at work and also driving climate change. I would believe that even when retreat is implemented, it must address this recognition justice. And it also needs to address issues of social justice when it comes to distribution of housing and resources. How does retreat allow for addressing those contemporary social justice challenges? And we also looked at cases where managed retreat had to do with environmental justice, thinking about distribution, not only procedural justice in terms of who is participating in retreat, but also how does the retreat allow for the distribution of benefits for different communities, also in relation to places where people move to. And another justice concern we were interested in is ecological justice. How does retreat allow us to address the benefit for these, for humans, but also for non-humans? That's an important aspect of justice that we paid attention to. And similarly, restorative justice, how does retreat allow for restoring a human relationship with one another, with the land, but also with the climate? And lastly, interracial justice, which has to do with considering not just the impact on this generation when people move, because if you move certain people from, let's say, from Miami coast, and some other people retain their generation that retain them may be able to accrue the economic benefit, while others who have moved may lose those benefits. So we're looking at cases that are actually allowed for intergenerational benefits beyond 7 generations, just as indigenous people have often talked about. How does retreat allow us to do that? And so all of these models, we're looking at how do they intersect with these different aspects of justice. We found out that the transformative justice, in fact, intersected with all of these different justice models that I've talked about. And the reformative did not quite address restorative justice. It didn't really address climate mitigation per se, or even essential restoration in ways that the transformative justice did. So it didn't really change the structure in the system. And the compensatory cases where in some cases it addressed social justice, in some cases it exacerbated social justice. So the compensatory was more linked to social justice issues, and in some cases it was linked to ecological justice issues, allowing for restoration of land. And there were cases where it was just about restorative models, which obviously intersected with ecological justice and also intersected with benefit for future generations. I'm just going to be fast a little because I'm looking at my time. So in terms of the types of models, the majority, as I mentioned earlier, was techno-managerial, just moving people from A to B without addressing equity issues. So these was a challenge. And then you can see the distribution for compensatory and reformative. And of course, the fewest was transformative example. In terms of their global distribution of the success models, and I think this is useful for us to know, as I mentioned earlier, that not all retreats are the same. It's useful for us to know that even when people are pro-retreat, you do want to know that it is in some way successful. So the success cases we found, it was in Rwanda and Fiji, and we'll be talking about it. And I think a lot of people in this conference do know about the Fiji case, but we would talk about it a little bit more. And you can see that the distribution of some of the failed cases, which is the ongoing and unsuccessful cases, you can see the black dot, and the ongoing cases, there are a lot of them in the global south. You can also see some in the global north. And you can see that the reformative cases it's actually distributed across, but most of the techno-managerial is concentrated part of the global south and some in the global north as well. And in terms of the people who are moving, looking at their class, a lot of the papers we explored actually show that a lot of the people, even when it was successful, it's mostly the low-income people that are being relocated. And some cases it was low income to mid income, and then some cases they were middle income. But we assume, because we don't know, for some cases, some literature did not quite mention who it was. So there are several cases where over 186 households, we don't know their class. So we assume there might be some few cases where high income people also were relocated, particularly maybe in the case of the compensatory model. In terms of funding, there are different funding folks. You can see some were from federal governments. There were some from federal and NGOs simultaneously. There were some were international NGOs supporting the local government. There were local NGOs. There were all kinds of people really funding retreat globally. This is the global distribution based on the case study that we explored. And in terms of the location, the success model by location, you can see the majority here is concentrated in the global south. We didn't find any compensatory model in the global south. A lot of the compensatory models that were successful were largely in the global north. But we also didn't find any transformative model in the global north. Both transformative models that we found were in the global south. We assume that the compensatory model might be because of the libertarian approach in many of the global north here, where you have institutions, you have FEMA that could give people money. We didn't find cases where people were giving money in the global south and told, take this money and move. We didn't see those cases in the global south. In terms of decision-making approaches, most of them were quite top-down, which is different from the model themselves. It's like, how does this decision, how were they made? So there were cases that were collaborative, there were cases that were polycentric, and there were a few that were bottom-up. And so we were interested in learning, how does the decision-making matter for success? You know, there's been all of this talk about, if it's bottom up, it's going to be successful. We found cases where it was bottom up and it was techno-managerial. So you can see here the transformative case studies, which was obviously the most successful case study from the perspective of people. Here, it was polycentric, but we found some cases that were reformative, that were bottom-up, polycentric, collaborative, and we also found some cases that started off as top-down and then later changed to collaborative, but they were still successful. But most of the techno-managerial were top-down, but there were a few cases that were techno-managerial that were also polycentric and bottom-up. And there were cases that were ecological, restorative, that were top-down and bottom-up. So it had, so the story here is that we must not romanticize whether it's community-based relocation or even bottom-up approaches, because different decision-making leads to different outcome. And so the decision-making is not the only factor that leads to success. So I'll just run and show you a few examples thinking about my time here. One example here is about a techno-managerial case study from Rwanda. And this case study is about farmers who have been relocated from flooding areas that were flooded. It was top down. There were powerful individuals that were dictating the outcome and the decision here. And a lot of people, in fact, felt that they lost their property right. They were given smaller plots and they were mandated not to return to the land. And they were threatened with violence. And so the only reason people didn't return to their previous land was because of threats. So they did move, but it was very techno-managerial and not success and not helpful in that sense, but it was successful just from A to B. We also found cases where this was community-led. 133 people moved from 24 households, but they moved to different locations. They moved from this Natumbi area to several locations. And the report was that it was disruptive to social cohesion. Traditional practices was not maintained. There were problems with sanitation. There was problems with drinking water. And the funding sources was just very scattered. Even though this was community-led, there was problems with it. So it was techno-managerial in how it was even implemented. Of course, because of time, I'll just rush through these. Lots of the compensatory cases were in Europe and in America here. But of course, I mentioned earlier that they were mostly driven by cost-benefit analysis. In some cases, some people said they felt that it benefited them, that it allowed them to move, and it, in fact, addressed equity for them. But there were other cases where it had this unintended racial effect in terms of the inequality that could be exacerbated by who is getting retreat and who is not, things like that. And there were some cases where in Kingston where people mentioned it was beneficial. There were cases in Oakwood Beach in New York that people mentioned it was beneficial. So it had this dual effect. And there were cases where it was compensatory, and then the land was also restored after the compensation were given, the land was restored. So we saw several of those cases. So this is another model that we found. And then one of the reformative cases that I found really exciting is also here, this is from the Philippines, where people were moving from, this is the barangay that people lived, and this is the area, this light area where people were relocating from, and they relocated to this dark area. The interesting thing about this case study is that about 3,500 households were relocated. It started off as top-down, where the government said, you have to move. But through the planning processes, it moved from being top-down because they implemented international guidelines like the Peninsula Guideline. They started talking about, they did a census. They also had proper consultation. At the end, it became a polycentric where the national government were involved, the NGOs were involved, the local offices and people. So it changed from just you have to move to really a different governance approach in terms of when it was implemented. However, when it was implemented, NGOs were in fact some of the frontiers or the front leaders implementing this. And people found that NGO A actually built better housing, and people, NGO B and C, people would complain that they didn't quite like the housing that NGO B and C built. And so you can see this is NGO A housing, this is NGO B housing, and there was this intra-community conflict, but overall, it still benefited people in terms of their livelihoods. And these are some of the data that shows the benefits. You can see average income per household before people relocated, and after they relocated, there was significant improvement. And obviously NGO A had much, people who were relocated by NGO A had more in terms of the percentage increase in their income also. But for all of the people that relocated, they felt that their income increased based on the new location. Similarly, people had access to electricity, water, toilet, public transportation. All of those things also improved for people after relocation. So this is why we classified it as reformative. And there are some cases here in the US and even other countries that were also reformative, as I showed you in the global map. And this is the final case study I'm just going to show you. penultimate final case study. This is a transformative model, which is in Fiji, where people move from Vinigololia to Kanani, which people call as Canaan land. The interesting thing about this case study, as many of you know, is that it's a case study. The relocation process started very early on in 2006. People eventually moved in, I believe, 2013, but it involved a lot of deep planning. The total people were relocated were 150 people. They were funding from government, from international NGOs, but also people donated their own labor and timber. So it was very participatory in that sense. The community were very involved. They moved from this low location and they moved to this new site. And of course, the new site was not free of problems. There were challenges with flooding and landslide, but they continued to implement risk mitigation, knowing that the IL ground was better, but people still had access to this place. The fishermen could still go back to this place if they wanted to, and so they were not excluded from using that land while they relocated them here. But the interesting thing about this relocation was that it was not only participatory, it improved people's lives. There was also issue about women's empowerment, where women were trained in how to create solar panels. And so there was new electrification based on solar panel. So access to renewable energy, children had access to school, housing, not just housing, I mean hospitals. So overall, there was improvement. And from the paper we analyzed, it was reported that people said life is easier here, literally. And so same thing, we found a similar case here in Rwanda. But the reason I put this question mark in the Rwanda case is because we don't have the detail of the process, but we have the detail of the outcome. And the person who literally told us about the Rwanda model villages is Lisa Dale at Columbia. And so she drew our attention to it, and we've been reading a lot of papers. We read several of the UNDP reports, several online reports. And we found out that these green villages, which was launched in 2021, when it was completed, it actually improved environmental and social protection, livelihood improvement. It reduced disaster challenges, and also allowed for improved nutrition, addressed food insecurity for people, people now send their kids to school. And also there was improvement in electrification as well. They were also focused on climate mitigation. So those two cases, it wasn't just about retrieving people and improving their life. It was also about how can this relocation also be a part of climate resilience and climate relocation, climate mitigation, even on a smaller scale for people. And in terms of economic training, capacity building, all of these things were reported in Fiji and in Rwanda. So these are the two case studies that met our criteria for the models we showed you. And so to conclude, we're arguing that we do need to flip the system. Right now, what we have at the top is the techno-managerial is the most common successful model, which is just about moving people from A to B. But we believe that we do need a lot of the transformative justice and reformative approaches that improves people's lives. And some compensatory ones have helped. That might still be something that people want to do. And of course, we obviously need the ecological restorative approaches, but the techno-managerial is really what we don't need. And I think that's what communities have been rejecting. They don't want to be managed. They want to have their self-determination in how to deal and respond to climatic risks. And so to flip the system, we've seen in our study that self-determination matters a lot, even when communities are working with government, whether they're working with local government, national government, or even with international NGOs. They need to be the ones to make those decisions about when to move, how to move, and what, and who should be involved. And also participation, we found that really matters a lot. For communities, their voices need to be heard. Even when doing environmental inspection and site inspection, their voices need to be heard. And we found out that decision-making for all of the cases that were successful was not decision driven by emergency or compelled by humanitarian concerns. They were decisions that were thought out, they were multilateral, they were very participatory in how they occurred. And also we found that the planning was robust. It took a while, but it did work out at the end. There was funding, so you do need funding. Cases where community projects were community-based without funding, it turned out it was quite difficult for communities to get this done, but some communities did get it done, but it was very challenging for them. So funding needs to be on the table. Capacity building and social cohesion mattered. Acceptance of some trade-off. There hasn't been any case, even the transformative justice case, it wasn't like all good. There were trade-offs that the community had to accept, that yes, we will lose this, but we'll gain a lot of this. And so that's why they accepted some of the decision to move. And so we need to be mindful of those trade-offs and let communities know that this would happen. And I think many of them do know this. already. Then there's also continued risk mitigation. When we move to new sites, there are things, climate change is not isolated to coastal areas or to drought-prone areas, it's everywhere. And so when you move to a new location, we have to think about what are the risks in those new locations and how do we continue to embark on risk mitigation in those new places so that people do not continue to move from one place to the other. And then there is also the issue of culture and social networks, which ranks very high for a lot of people. And we believe relocation must allow for the maintenance of these networks for people. And lastly, the issue of social livelihoods, social services and infrastructure for people to lead the kind of life they want are important. So I'll end it there. And I don't know if I have time for question and answer, but thank you all for being here and thank you for listening. That's it from me.
Thank you, Jola. That was a tour de force. And unfortunately, we did run out of time, but and I have tons of things I'd love to discuss with you, but I think we'll just close it there. But thank you so much. It was really a very educational presentation. And obviously, we have a long way to go in terms of learning what makes for successful or how to implement successful and transformative resettlement, but you're pointing the way, so we appreciate that. Thank you again, Jola. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.